Even if you aren't a nature nerd, we've all been in at least one science class where a nature documentary was played. You know, the intense chase of a cheetah and gazelle, or the crocodile stalking the water buffalo. All the brutality softly narrated by David Attenborough. But have you ever wondered what goes on behind the scenes of the film crew for these projects? My next guest has worked on wildlife documentary projects for the BBC, Netflix, NatGeo, Disney, and Discovery, to name a few. He was the technical coordinator for Planet Earth 2 and is currently working on a project for the BBC, which is where I met him, sort of. It was actually in line at the airport in Mongolia. Today, he's going to pull back the curtain on the production of Nature Nerd's favorite TV genre as we explore the nuance that lives in the ethics and efforts of wildlife documentary filmmaking. Filming nature, coordinating chaos, living the dream, Louis Labrom. You made it. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi. I'm here.
You're here. You're here. I'm really glad that we met and that we can do this in between your projects because, you know, there's a lot of moving parts to filmmaking life. Are you allowed to share anything about that project that you're working on now?
That project's slightly problematic, I think, purely because from a non-disclosure level, it's not gone out yet, and so it's not been announced. So that's all semi-secretive. I think we'd probably get away with telling you where I was, but apart from that, I think specifics is tricky, which is one of the downsides of what I do, even though there are many, many upsides. Talking about it publicly is well, being enabled to talk about it publicly is a bit of a downside because there's some amazing things that I see and amazing adventures I go on, but kind of have to keep it under wraps until it hits the big screen, which can be 3 or 4 years down the line.
Yeah.
So,
Do you have a watch party with your friends when that happens?
yeah, a watch party of sorts, but it's just because the projects go on for so long and you work on so many different projects, you're really kind of tripping over yourself about keeping secrets. And I'm not the best keeper of secrets. So, yeah, saying kind of you just go off on a tangent and talk to somebody about something and you're like, oh, I'm not sure I should have said that.
Oops.
But anyway, it's done now.
When you're on location for filming, is there a set amount of time that you have to get everything on like a shot list? Or are you basically there until you get, you know, the elusive animal that you've sought out to get?
Yeah, so I mean, each job is different depending on what animal you're filming, what country you're filming in, the behavior you're trying to film. Each time we go out, we usually have a set list of shots that we need and a set behavior that we're going for. And roughly, there's kind of an urban legend, but within the industry as a whole, it's kind of like a week, a minute for most things that we film. So for the minute of footage that you guys see on TV, that usually takes around a week per minute. But then if the behavior is quite complex, it might be 2 weeks a minute. But roughly it's around a week a minute. So for a 4-minute sequence, 4 weeks work, kind of the way it works. Quite a lot of time for not much screen time.
Oh my gosh. What animal would you just like shit a brick if you were able to get on video?
It's super cliche, but the snow leopard is like top because it's just so elusive. The ghost cat, really harsh environment to work in, cold, rocky mountainous, camping out for days on end, and basically so perfectly camouflaged against the environment, almost impossible to film. But when you get it, it's something quite special. So I think that's the pinnacle.
Yeah, I think it was in the Planet Earth too, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Planet Earth 2, we did some snow leopards because obviously Planet Earth 2 was roughly 10 years after the transmission of Planet Earth 1, which the snow leopard was another big part of. And with these series, there's a big portion of that that's revisiting things 10 years down the line, partly to see how it's changed, but also to kind of remind people that these things still exist and it's still quite hard, even though the world has become much smaller with the ability to travel quite quickly and get to various places. Trying to get that footage of that particular animal is still quite tough.
Is there any animal other than the snow leopard that it's pretty much impossible to film either because it's so elusive or because of the harsh environment?
There are definitely some. So like a lot of rainforest cats, there's various wild cats in places like Borneo and South America that are very elusive, very difficult to film, and small rodents and things that we thought were extinct that aren't. But for the most part, most things have been filmed. I think more the problem is for us as filmmakers is filming the animal doing the thing we set out to see it do rather than finding the animal itself. Like if you want to go and film elephants, you can find elephants, but are they going to be doing what you want them to do? Not necessarily. And animals tend not to read shot lists and scripts, so it's It's slightly problematic.
So basically, all that's left is like the cryptids, like Bigfoot.
Yeah, I don't know, the Loch Ness Monster and that kind of stuff. Just try and get the big things off the list and see if we can make it work. For the most part, a lot of things have been filmed. Everything's kind of been covered, which is a bit of a struggle when it comes to trying to engage people in new stories and new behaviors. There's a lot of people out there discovering these things all the time, but there's only so many things to film, and there's a lot of us doing it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when I think about nature documentaries in the 90s and even the early 2000s, oh my gosh, they are lame compared to right now. The shots and the story and the up close captures from the wildlife documentaries now are just incredible. Like in Planet Earth 2, there's like Father Frog, I think is what the narrator called him, like the frog protecting his eggs from the wasp. And it shows...
The glass frog,
yeah, and it shows like the little frogs and the eggs wiggling around. And I'm like, what the hell? How do they do that? And then the elephants, I know you worked on the elephant stuff. That freaks me out because elephants are like awesome, but they're also kind of a little scary. And the shot makes it look like you're an elephant in between the mama and the baby. Like you can see the little baby on the one side and the mama on the other side. And then the birds, you know, flying in formation. And it's like the bird has the camera on him, like he's a paid crew member. How are you getting these?
Well, I think it's tricky. What's great is that we have Planet Earth 1 to look back on, and we can go, okay, well, that's how they did it then. How do we do it now? 10 years in technology terms, especially at the rate that we're moving now, is massive. I mean, back then, they'd really only just transitioned from film. A lot of original Planet Earth would have been shot on film and then probably pushed to tape. So still film in a certain way, but not digital. It was the advent of HD as well, so that was a new thing for everybody. And the traditional ways of making wildlife documentaries were still there. And Planet Earth as a series is still the best ever made, in my opinion, especially for the time and how they did it and all of the complications that they would have had with the limitations of the equipment and environments and extreme conditions and all that. But now, technology is more readily available. It's cheaper. New things have come onto the market that have completely revolutionized our industry, like drones and handheld gimbals and aerial gimbals and macro lenses and small cameras that you can hide in GoPros and that kind of thing. So we use Planet Earth 1 as a basis to look at some of the sequences, and that's why we revisit quite a lot, because it's okay, well, we've filmed the snow leopard half a mile away, really kind of soft in the distance, but now we want to get really up close and personal. We want it to walk over the camera. And how do we do that? An enormous part of that progression and that development of our genre is to be able to bring the audience closer to the animals, because when you're filming an animal on the end of a long lens, you do feel somewhat removed. So the idea is this immersive nature of bringing the audience, bringing that natural world into your living room, almost like that 3D effect where there's something's walking over you and you're looking and you're in a big dome theatre and you've got the red and blue glasses on, old school 3D. And that's the aim, is to bring the natural world into your living room. And in order to do that, we have to get really creative and we have to get super techy. What's interesting now is that the technology really is driving our industry forward. There are demands to get the glass frog, for instance. It's let's get closer, let's get better shots, let's get right up next to them, let's get all of the tiny intricate details, let's try and film this in high speed, let's do it in slow motion, let's do time lapses, let's do motion control, repeat moves. The technological side of things is moving so quickly that it's sometimes hard to keep up, but also it drives the industry forward, but also allows us to show stories that we have kind of shown in the past, but in a completely different way. Something that we wouldn't have been able to do 15, 20 years ago because of the limitations of the camera technology, we're now allowed to do. And it almost reinvigorates the story to something that you've never seen it before. So it feels brand new and fresh, but essentially the behavior is the same. It's a very different perspective.
So are you allowed to share like the elephant one, for example? How did y'all do that?
Well, the elephant one in Planet Earth 2 wasn't me. Those were in my junior days. But since Planet Earth 2, a lot of elephant programs have been made, and a lot of which I've been involved in. There are many ways to film an elephant, but for the most part, safety is key and disturbance of wildlife is a priority. Traditionally, when filming elephants, you would just do it with a camera on a tripod head that's mounted to the side of a vehicle, and you could drive around, drive up and film them. And elephants, for the most part, in these places where they're filmed quite regularly, quite used to vehicles because of tourism and safari. So it's not really a problem. We'd normally do it from there. These days, that still exists, but we have drones. So we're hovering overhead, although elephants aren't fond of drones that much. They actually resemble the noise of bees, which freaks them out weirdly. So drones are a big thing, but gyrostabilized 6-axis gimbals that are mounted on kind of the bottom, the ones that you see on the bottom of police helicopters and movie helicopters and stuff, they're what we use mounted to the front of a vehicle to get all of those amazing tracking shots and moving along with the elephants. And elephants as animals journey a lot. So most of the story about an elephant is moving from one point to another point, whether it's water, whether it's feeding grounds, whatever it is. And so in order to tell that story, you want to move with them. So we had to throw tech in there to be like, okay, well, I want to move with these animals. How are we going to do it? So chuck a helicopter gimbal on a vehicle and track alongside it. What's the worst that can happen? Weirdly, terrible things can happen.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's an inherent risk in wildlife filming anyway, but financial risk is a big thing as well. And you have to be willing to lose the kit to tell the story. And then that's just the way it is. They're tools. So, you know, if you buy a hammer, you hit a nail with it. You don't leave it on a shelf shiny and...
Yeah. Oh, that's hard though. Cause yeah, I feel that. Okay. So the birds, is that drones?
Birds and Planet Earth 2, they were, in order to tell that story, I assume we're talking about the golden eagles in Switzerland.
Well, I have seen this particular camera angle in a few nature shows. We watch a lot of them. We kind of overconsume this sort of genre.
There's no such thing.
Yeah. So any example that you want to give in specificity, I will accept.
Well, I mean, this is going to be really maybe a little bit of a buzzkill, but it's basically just a very, very small camera strapped onto an eagle's back, which sounds kind of crazy, but in wildlife films, we stay as true to the sequence and the story that we can and the behavior that we're filming. And for the most part, the animals that we film are 100% wild animals, wild behavior. We don't use tame animals for sequences and we say, oh, this animal is a wild animal, blah, 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 if it's tame, because that's not a moral thing that we kind of pride ourselves on. We want to be as true to the audience as we can be. However, for certain shots, like the one with the eagle that you're talking about, on all of the occasions that it's been done, I assume multiple times, they've either used a falconry bird, so like a trained eagle, the homing eagle, or an eagle that has been raised in a conservation centre and released that allows them to get the camera onto it, because, you know, trapping a bird, strapping a camera to it, letting it go, and then how do you get it back? So there's slight problems involved and all that, and the logistics are a bit of a nightmare. But for those very specific shots, and one or two shots, they'll either use an animal that's trained or an animal that's been raised in a conservation centre and released as part of a conservation effort with all the appropriate organisations, and then that camera will, after certain periods of time, there's a small latch on it that'll tick and it'll just fall off. And it will go and be collected, and you can pick it up by a GPS antenna. And that's kind of how they do it with things like whales and seabirds and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's quite sophisticated stuff, but
it's cool.
Interesting little angle.
I mean, it's like James Bond stuff. There was a nature documentary where they had like another film crew filming the film crew. And I think that was like my favorite because, you know, I wanted to see, is the baby tiger biting the kid? What is happening over there? So then they stitch it together to make the story. So is that what they do? Like they're showing the wild eagle and then they cut to this eagle that has been part of a rehabilitation program and they're kind of like putting the story together like that.
Yeah, the stories are pieced together. So in that kind of scenario, 99.9% of the sequence will be your wild eagle displaying wild behaviors that they've worked very hard to try and film and moved heaven and earth to get permits for, and because all of these animals are protected and there are various organizations restricting the filming access to certain birds. For those shots that bring the audience on the journey, if I really want to get a shot of this eagle soaring in the sky, how do we do that? The reality is to do that with a wild animal is impossible. So you have to work around it. And again, we pride ourselves on being as honest with our audience as possible, and that all of that kind of the methods of doing that is in all of the post-release literature. It's all there for people to read. But in order to get that shot, the safest and most practical way to do that is to use a bird that's either tame or to use a bird that we can have access to that's being released and is under the care of an organisation. And you'll see that entire sequence, but those two shots of the eagle's head as it's moving through the Alps is potentially a trained bird or a rescued bird. But that's not to distract or detract the audience from the sequence itself. The sequence that has been told and the science behind it is all accurate. The idea is to be able to up our game visually. We have to go around and take certain steps to deliver new and interesting and immersive shots. Very similar to a series like BBC David Attenborough's Africa, where in the actual narration, when they were filming the rock python, as it crawls into this burrow, there's this beautiful shot of it coming in. It's tracking backwards as it's coming towards you. Really creepy, really gets your heart going. And they say in the commentary line, I believe the phrase is, in a specially created or in a specialist filming burrow. This is a wild animal, but they've created an environment for it to live and rigged it with cameras. So kind of like Big Brother, reality TV, Love is Blind, whatever it is. It's an environment that they've created. They've stuck a load of cameras in it. And that is the safest, most practical, most cost-effective, most least impact way for us to film that animal exhibiting that behavior given the restrictions. Because otherwise, we're back into the old early 1900 days of trying to film animals where people are just tackling them down and grabbing them and then releasing them on camera. It's like we try and have as little impact as possible. And if there's a story to be told, animal ambassadors is a phrase that's used a lot. Animal ambassadors will allow us to tell that story, but also in order for us to not harm or bring any danger or hazard to any of the animals, there is the need to potentially use specialist filming burrows, a trained animal for a shot or two here or there, but never would you use a trained animal and portray it to be a wild animal for a wild sequence. Look at this animal soaring above the hills of the Alps. It's like, that's just not the way it is. I think being honest with our audience is very important to us, but there is like a moral conundrum of if you are going to intercut those two things, you have to be very honest about it. And there's been a couple of occasions in the past where some productions have been pulled up on it, but for the most part, I think we've done our audience a service, but also the animals themselves.
Well, yes, and I want to get into that conundrum, as you put it, of the give and the take of like, yeah, it is a moral dilemma, because if you don't make it entertaining, nobody watches it. But also, if it's considered solely entertainment, then people think of it as stuff over there at that distant place, and there's no interconnectedness. So I'm going to bookmark that in my brain there for a second, but I want to come back to something that you said about, in the old days where they would tackle animals and then show them on camera. Is it true that they used to take just like snakes, I think it was the example that I heard, like they would release a snake, it was like a pet, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, look at this snake, oh my gosh, I can't believe I found this, and they would show it on camera? I mean, is that just a rumor?
I don't know. I wasn't around in the 1900s, to preface that. But I imagine at some point across the history of all of that, same with making movies and stuff, there's always been an element of, how would you say it?
Enhanced
dramatization.
reality.
Enhanced reality. What we're doing is we're getting into a genre debate, and genres are very important, and it's a very important distinction. So I work primarily in natural history, factual entertainment. So what we do is documentary. We document, we tend not to intervene and all that kind of stuff. There are other genres that I have dabbled in here and there, which is more like animal entertainment, animal factual entertainment. So like Homeward Bound, they're not wild dogs, they're pets, but they use the dogs as animal actors. And there is a market for wildlife documentaries such as that allow you to tell a really intricate story of something you would never see before. But in order to do that, you have to use animals that you can handle, that you can rear, that you can move around. And it's dangerous to take one out of the environment, or it's unethical to take one out of the environment, but can you use somebody's animal that is a wild animal, has been caught wild or rescued in a rescue centre, and can you use that to tell your story? Yes, you can. Have you got to be very honest about it? Yes. Have you got to be very clear about it in the narrative? Yes. There's no prizes for misleading your audience. So yeah, I don't know of any personal stories that I've worked on or been party to where people have kind of released something and gone, oh my gosh, look at this wild animal. But I'm sure it used to happen by way, way, way in the olden days. But these days we pride ourselves on trust and responsibility. And if we're not telling a wild story, then our viewers aren't going to engage.
Yeah. And the story part is important. I'm trying to think of more examples, but Father Frog is just in my memory this morning. So because it was like, it's, anthropomorphizing an amphibian, which on the one hand is really cool, right? Because then we care about an animal that typically we don't care about because it's not a mammal. Like there's a bias. Like we're mammals, we care about mammals, especially mammals with big round eyes that, from some sort of evolutionary standpoint triggers our maternal and paternal instincts to go, oh my God, let's like save the whatever it is. But like the glass frog, we're like, I don't know, even though it does have big eyes. But that story, it was like, okay, cut to the wasp. and then cut to the frog, cut to the larvae. And it tells the story that really is like there's an arc of the story. I mean, it is true storytelling.
Yeah.
And then there's sounds that are added so that you do feel, as you said, immersive, like you're in that moment with Father Frog. At what point, though, I guess this is a kind of an opinion question, do you feel like that creative license, the story crafting and the music, becomes over dramatized and distracts from the point and the mission of conservation?
That's a tough one. Obviously, with anything, there is the ability to overindulge and go a bit beyond what's necessary. I don't personally think that, for the most part, in order to get our audience, us as human beings, us as mammals, to relate to a story, we have to bring it into our world. And so it's Daddy Frog, and Daddy Frog's protecting his babies from this horrible wasp. It's just nature playing its course, and that's just how it happens. But in order to make you care, we have to make it seem like it's happening to us. And that's the only way to get our audience to react. So in terms of the script that's being said, the words that are used, like Daddy Frog or whatever, you're not giving it names, but we're kind of making up, and there's a little bit of creative license in terms of naming it and protecting its babies and froglets, tadpoles, whatever.
And they definitely give the meerkats names. I mean, meerkats, they're like, that's Susie, there's Joe over there, Dylan.
Yeah,
Dylan's always a problem.
There's a lot of animals in the world, especially famous meerkats, that have been named. And yeah, there's some questionable name choices, but for the most part, the animals that we film don't tend to have names. And we try and keep it that way. Is the science behind what the narrative is saying factually accurate? Yes. It's fact-checked to the nth degree by multiple people, and then once it's edited and the story's put in, it's fact-checked again. It's sent to the research scientists that we liaise with to find those stories to fact-check again, and if not, they're pulling us up and they're saying, no, you need to change that because that's not factually accurate and that's not what's happening here. Or we'll show them stuff and it's, oh, that's new behavior, so maybe this is that and that is this, and it's not straightforward. But creative license is key in terms of engaging our audience and keeping it engaging and up to date and entertaining. We're in the business of entertainment, but we're trying to show you something that's factually accurate. And sometimes the things that are factually accurate aren't as entertaining for you as they would be me, or me as they would be you. So we have to make it kind of universal and make everybody appreciate it. And what's the best way to do that? First and foremost, it's to anthropomorphize it. Bring you in, get you supporting that character. You're involved in the jeopardy. You want the frogs to survive and you want the wasp to get kicked off the leaf or whatever it is, but no one cares about the wasp. So you have to anthropomorphize it to some degree to get the audience to relate. Can you go too far with that? There are examples, I think, personally, and it's a personal taste thing rather than a hard line. There are some projects and some documentaries and some films that do that, and they're not totally my cup of tea. Sometimes it works in its favor, and especially if it's a character-led story. If you're following one animal, that you know that animal and you know it by name and you know its distinctive patterns and you're telling the story of that animal, then it's imperative that you do and give it a name and bring the audience in and make them care. That's all part of why we're doing it. There's a story to be told. You're following this one animal. To call it Lion 616 is probably not as engaging as calling it Simba or Nala or it's copyright infringement, but you know.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's important. Creative license is important, but I think it's very important that we don't go too far. And things with like sound and dramatic music, if we were to just play the sounds of the natural world over the things that are happening, for the most part, it would be quite unengaging. I don't say boring because it's beautiful in a completely different way, but it'd be quite, disengaging. So the music helps ramp up the drama, but the music is dictated by the action, not the other way around. So the soundtracks that are created by the likes of George Fenton and Hans Zimmer, those are created in line with the edit and the way the behavior is playing out. So if the lion's jumping on the giraffe's back, that's the crescendo point as the music comes in. Then when it falls, the music dies down. You can hear the natural sounds of it falling into the ground, and then the music ramps up again. The chase is back on. And it's all about keeping you engaged. And music is an incredibly important tool in telling our stories because it can decide whose team you're on. It can decide what the outcome of the whole story is before it even starts. It's a very, very important factor, but very much the music is dictated by the action rather than the action dictated by the music, if that makes sense.
And great point about it determines whose team you're on. So there's like that dilemma of, do we want the wasp to starve? Or, you know what I mean? And we tend to, as I said earlier, we're biased towards the animals that are also mammals, who have big, cute eyes and furry bodies. And yeah, so it can create maybe like an oversimplification of nature where people who don't have, we'll say, a robust environmental ethic, to them it's just like a Disney thing, you know?
I think that in the past that probably was a thing, but I think as a community, which in the grand scheme of things, the wildlife industry is relatively small compared to things like factual television or movies. We like to think we're very important, but we're still quite a small community. There is an inherent standard of sort of editorial policy and making sure that certain behavior in terms of how we make films and the honesty that's being transmitted through script, there is a kind of an unwritten rule that everyone adheres to the same standard. And when people don't, the industry as a whole is very quick at pulling people up and holding them to account if things aren't factually accurate. I don't think you could get away with doing something that was factually inaccurate these days, because it would be the community in itself kind of self-monitors itself, and we're all very passionate about doing the same thing, which is saving the natural world, portraying the natural world, bringing it into your household, and raising the quality of natural history television for our audience. And if one person decides to go around that and do something that soils that reputation, then the industry as a whole is very good at kind of coming down and making sure that doesn't happen again, or making sure that that gets corrected. That is one of the big things with the natural world, is that you don't want to misrepresent it. And misrepresentation of the natural world is something that the industry as a whole for many, many years has been accused of by various outlets and various media organizations. And it's important that they do that, because if people were being dishonest, they need to be told, especially when you're throwing facts at people that might not be factually accurate. That's really, really important. Do I think there's ever been a case in my time where it's been damaging to the reputation of the industry or misled people in a deliberate way? Not that I'm aware of, but yeah, I like to think we're pretty honest with our audience, and if there is something to be told, we're pretty upfront about it.
There's kind of a movement, greater industry-wide, for disclosure and permissions, especially around AI. When I'm watching some of the nature documentaries, there are clips where I'm like, oh, that was an AI clip that they just put in there. And there's no asterisk or anything, no disclosure. What do you see in terms of the future of wildlife documentary filmmaking and the use of AI?
So AI is something that's obviously relatively new for us. It's not been something that we have relied on or found a particular need for up until now. It's obviously quite a hot topic. In terms of integrity and trust and being honest with our audience, that's a really important factor. There have been a few new series that have used things like AI or artificially generated elements, animals, bits of behavior, scenes, I would say, as an overall, or I don't know, if there's a bumblebee in a shot or something like that, then they can create that. At the end of a lot of the documentaries, post-credits, that kind of stuff, they're very open about that. I like to think. I don't think I've seen one recently that doesn't end like a post-credit scene with some of the images in here were artificially generated but purely for entertainment purposes. For the most part, the reason that they're using things like artificial intelligence or image generation is to place something within a shot that would be impossible to get normally, but that isn't an integral part of the scientific-based behavior. An example, you're following a bumblebee, and a bumblebee is flying through this canopy, and the bumblebee's this big, and you're following it with an 8K camera that's capable of shooting Hollywood movies on a FPV drone. The ability to be able to do that is pretty much impossible. So in order to do that, you would film the shot with a drone, and then you would comp or superimpose the bee in there, but the bee is just flying. If the bee was, I don't know, knitting, it would probably be quite misleading. But I think for the most part, it's okay, well, a little bit of creative license. We can have the bee flying in this shot, because otherwise it would be impossible to get. And actually, we're not misleading anybody. Bees do fly.
Oh, right.
We're just going along the journey with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then you're not interrupting the behavior. So there's also like this unknown. I'll be curious where this leads us in the next 10 years, because you said, you know, elephants are really, speaking of bees, quite bothered by drones because they feel like bees. When my husband and I went to Yellowstone a few years back, one of the rangers told us and others, if you're close enough to the animal that it changes its behavior, you're too close to the animal. And I thought that's a pretty good rule of thumb. But how does that work for wildlife documentary filmmaking? Because you're putting a drone over an elephant and you're in the jungle next to a family of bonobos, there's definitely an awareness on behalf of the animal that you're there.
Yeah, so for the most part, your rule of thumb from your ranger in Yellowstone is exactly the same for us. If you're near the animal's behavior is changing, or you interrupt or disrupt the animal from doing what it was doing, you're too close. And it's funny because our goal is to get as close as possible to bring you to that level. If I want you to feel as close to the animal as I was when I was filming it. And that is very difficult, just optically. It's very, very difficult. So as a rule of thumb, if the animal changes its behavior when you're near, you're too close. We have the luxury of working with people who are professional guides, professional animal behaviorists, conservationists. And these people have spent years working with the specific animal that their research project is on, or that they've dedicated their life to conserving. With a lot of animals, there's an element of fieldcraft involved. Same with things like hunting. You don't just walk up to the deer that you're stalking. You gradually move, and then you wait for it to put its head down, and you move a bit further. You move a bit further, bit by bit by bit. Very similar with wildlife in that you want to reduce the amount of impact you're having on its behavior so that you can get in there and film the most natural behavior that that animal is exhibiting. That's what we do day in, day out. It's about fieldcraft, it's about knowing the animal, it's about coming from downwind. It's all very well thought out. But things like the bonobo families, for instance, those will know that those bonobo families are there because there'll be somebody there who studied them for their entire life, and they know them all by name, and they know their lineage for the last 40 years. And so we have the luxury of going in and working with them, and they get as close to the bonobos, for instance. And when they say, you're too close, time to pull back, you pull back, because although we're all passionate animal behaviorists and passionate naturalists, fundamentally our goal is to film the most wild scene, natural scene, uninterrupted scene as possible. And the way to do that is to work with the people that know the animals best. I could be in Africa one day and South America the next, and Mongolia the next, and the Arctic the next. I can't best practice with every single animal as well as each of the individual caretakers, guides, or animal experts, animal behaviorists does in those patches. So we rely enormously on their input and their expertise. And without them, as well as the researchers, fixers, guides, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. But yes, there is an element of animal interruption, and sometimes it's inevitable through for whatever reason. But at that point, you work backwards. Yeah. So at the point where you've gone, oh, we've interrupted, we've got to start working back. And we know we've reached our limit here, let's pull back. But in some occasions, you don't get the opportunity to. The animal scarpers, and that's the whole shoot over. And some occasions, you're lucky where you can just start taking ever so slight steps backwards. But also, a big thing for us is if an animal is very skittish or very elusive or isn't used to people, there are methods that we use to be able to do that. Things like blinds, the same things you would use for hunting, or stakeouts, or whatever, the same thing the military uses, just camouflage hides to put you in a position to remove your profile so that the animal can walk through relatively undisturbed. Its environment looks very similar. There's not this weird human figure looking at it with 20 people standing around looking directly down to it with a load of lights and all that kind of stuff. Big film crew.
Big boom arm, yeah.
Yeah, so we use things like hides and blinds, and there are specifically built structures to film things like bears at feeding stations. You have those at Yellowstone and Yosemite and that kind of stuff. They are utilised to have the least amount of impact on those animals that are very elusive and very skittish. The luxury of things like elephants and lions and cheetahs is the tourism aspect and the safari aspect. Those animals are in protected areas of national park, and within those national parks they run safaris, and animals are very used to vehicles, so they tend not to even notice that you're there when you're in a vehicle. Obviously, if you're driving right up to it, it's going to be concerned, but for the most part, the vehicle becomes part of the landscape.
That's interesting.
If you were on foot, it would probably not be a fan.
Yeah. How many times have you been in a situation that is a little sketchy with an animal?
A lot of times, but not to the point where it was life or death or anything like that, because all of the situations that we're in are very, very considered and we're very well thought through, and obviously guides and safety experts and health and safety is very rigorous. But sometimes things can just happen, and there's no amount of planning that can put you in that scenario, and it's a sequence of events that you couldn't have predicted, and all of a sudden you're stood there like, shit, I really shouldn't have been in this position, but right, how do we get out of it? So 90% of our job is problem solving, I would say.
Yeah.
So yes, I have absolutely been in positions that I probably wouldn't tell my mother about for fear of her worrying, but I've never really been in a situation where it's been too dangerous for us to manage. And actually, I would argue that the most dangerous thing that we come across when filming in the natural world is people. It's people, it's traffic, it's machinery, it's poachers, it's all of those things. And for the most part, when we're filming in these places, lions and whatever, and bonobos, and one of the biggest things on our risk analysis, our risk assessment, is driving to and from the airport, or being in taxis, or being in cars, because you can't account for the person driving behind you, or driving next to you, or driving in front of you, or drives into the side of you. So
No,
with
that
the
actually makes sense.
slightly more deadly animals, I feel more comfortable.
Yeah. That actually makes sense, because as I was thinking about all the layers of wildlife documentary filmmaking, I was thinking, oh man, there must be like a point where you come to the edge of what could become journalism. Because, for example, the Brazilian government and deforestation, or to use an example from the USA, the history of how and why the National Park Service was created. It wasn't like all goodwill like everyone thinks it is. Do you ever find that where it's like right at the edge of, okay, like poachers and stuff like that? Does that ever enter your mind?
I don't want it to sound too doom and gloom, but for the most part, I think that the areas that I'm very fortunate to go and film in are only there because somebody has decided to protect it. If somebody hadn't, they wouldn't be there, which is a really sad thought, but amazing that's there and it's still there and people are willing to protect it. But it's a really sad thought that it has to be protected for it to still remain, otherwise it might be gone. I think that we operate in a time where the natural world is diminishing rapidly, and I worry that over the course of my career, which may only span another 30 years or so, there won't be many wild places left to film that aren't gated complexes or compounds or concessions or national parks. And that's worrying for me, because when you gate something in, it doesn't become as wild as it used to be. I think we're very quickly coming to a point in our history where wilderness is something that is going to be quite rare, whereas previously it was the norm. And that's quite sad. And I worry about that, which is probably why I, A, enjoy being outside more than inside and on my own in the woods and filming things that are quite elusive, but B, why I want to film these places, and I want to go to these last refuges of these animals, and I want to look at changing government policy to protect these areas en masse rather than designating them and allowing logging to continue here and allowing fishing to go there and a coral depletion here and whaling there. I don't want that. And I know that that is a bit rose-tinted and ideal world situation, and there are complications with that, but I want there to be more wild spaces because we need them as much as we need high-rise complexes or drilling for new oil. They are as important to our existence as oil wells, oil farms, solar turbine farms, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's overlooked quite a lot. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question really. It probably doesn't.
No, I think that's the point is, sometimes questions lead to more questions, and that's okay, because it's not like storybooks when we were kids where it was like, here's a good guy and a bad guy and the end, like that's not real.
Infinitely more complex.
Yeah, it's more complex. Yeah. Animals eat each other. Humans need oil. We need homes. It is complex, and it's good to keep kind of an open mind, open heart, open hand about it all, and not to be married to any one way, because maybe a new technology comes along that would help us be more gentle on the place that we live on the earth.
Yeah, I think we have to be pragmatic in that turning all cities into green spaces and going a bit I Am Legend and removing humanity from places isn't a practical thing to do. We need to conserve the wild spaces we've got, and we need to apply more value to them because they are important for all of us, even just from a mental health point of view, like being outside is important. I just think that the easy thing to do is to say, don't build that complex of condos there and don't build a new road here. And it's like, well, but we need those things as much as we need the space. So how do we not necessarily compromise or find a middle ground, but how can we make both things viable whilst not impacting either one of them? And I think that there is always a solution. It just might not be what everybody wants, but best of a bad situation. I guess.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I can't think of a better way to wrap this up. Tell people how they can stay in touch with what you're doing, and if you want to tell them about any project that you're allowed to talk about right now that they can look up, this would be a good time to do it too.
Yeah, so my Instagram, which I'm very inactive on at the moment, is at Louis Labrom. That's LOUISLABROM. And my website is the same, www.louislabrom.com. Recently in the US, two series have just gone out and one series is to come. A series that I just worked on, David Attenborough's Mammals, transmitted its first show on July 13th, and the last episode transmits August 24th. That's on BBC America and AMC. Then we've got Earth Sounds, which is an Apple Plus TV series all about the sounds of the natural world and what they mean. So a slightly different take on wildlife documentary, whereas sound is the leader rather than the visuals, which was a real pleasure to work on. And then the big news, latest news, is that the very own Mr. Tom Hanks is going to be narrating a series that I worked on for the BBC America, that will be here in spring this year, I believe. And that'll be on NBC and AMC Plus, I think.
And what's it called?
So, yeah. That's going to be called The Americas. So that's South, Central, and North America, as well as the Caribbean. So that's going to be, that's been a 4-year project that the team have worked on, and it's going to be pretty good.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I'm very much looking forward to that. Plus, it's home turf for you guys, so you get to see a bit more of your local natural world.
Oh, I love that. I have goosebumps. Well, I'm adding all that to my watch list, so thank you. And thank you for this. This was fantastic.
No stress. It was a pleasure to meet you in an airport queue in the middle of Mongolia.
Same.